Hi everyone and welcome to today's webinar, The Great Digital Debate. My name is Marie-Claire and I work for IB Europe, and we're very pleased to host this webinar this afternoon with our webinar Rubicon Project Talaria, in which our Chief Economist Daniel Knapp and Rubicon's CTO Tom Kershaw will have a live discussion about the current state of the future of digital advertising, both presenting their thesis of where digital will be in 5 years' time. They will then debate their conclusions with the expert help of today's moderator, Valérie Letranche, MD France and Belgium for Rubicon Project Talaria. But before I hand over to Valérie, just a couple of housekeeping points to note. So firstly, the audience Q&A. This is a live event, and we therefore encourage you to submit your questions for Daniel and Tom in the Q&A box, which you will see at the bottom of the Zoom window, and we will aim to answer as many as possible. Any other queries, technical queries, etc., should be sent to the IB Europe team via the chat box. The webinar is being recorded and will be available to view on the IB Europe website later on. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Val to kick off today's webinar. Thanks, Val.
Hello, thank you, Marie-Claire, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining from your homes or your offices, wherever you are. I hope you're all safe. So my name is Valérie. I'm the Managing Director for Rubicon Talaria for France and Belgium. I'm based in Paris. And I'm pleased to welcome you and to welcome Daniel and Tom for this session we co-host with the AAB Europe today. Webinar is, I think, not the perfect word to describe what we're gonna face and experience together. It's more like a debate, and I'm pleased to have those brilliant minds discussing for us today about what's next probably for industry in the next 5 years. So I would like maybe Tom and Daniel to do a quick say hello and introduce yourself first, and then we'll go through your brilliant ideas. Maybe Daniel, you can start?
Sure. Hello. Hi, everyone. My name is Daniel Knapp. I'm the Chief Economist at IB Europe, and I've been an industry analyst in the broader domain of advertising for the last 13 years. And one of my main interests really is the area of programmatic advertising, how it's changing, the role of data, the role of algorithms, and how changes in the macro affect the micro and the other way around. And look forward to our debate today.
Thank you. Tom?
Great. Hi, I'm Tom Kershaw. I'm Chief Technology Officer of Rubicon Project Talaria. I'm also the chairman of Prevent.org, which is an open source software organization for the advertising industry. So hello and hi, everybody.
Thank you. So you're two experts of our industry. You're going to discuss the near future, but as a warm-up and exercise, we've asked you to briefly create a thesis on what's next and what's next for industry, basically. So looking past COVID-19, like trying to have a broader perspective on how things will evolve. So maybe we can start with you, Tom. Tell us what you think about it.
Sure. Thanks, Val. I think, my main thesis, if you want to call it that, is that the last few months have been an accelerant to programmatic. So programmatic has continued to kind of slowly take over digital advertising and unify it around an automated data-driven model, and we've seen a dramatic tick up in the pace of that migration, just because of more eyeballs on screen, an accelerated use of CTV, and over-the-top mechanisms of viewing long-form content. All of that is just accelerating trends that already existed, but it's also exposing holes and fissures in our industry that have needed to be fixed for a long time. And probably at the top of mind there is the identity model. The identity model by which we tailor our message to specific groups of people is literally broken and needs to be reinvented and rethought. And kind of how that plays out and what type of model we land on is still very much in flight. And there are different points of view, some trying to preserve the core foundations of the current system, and others trying to completely rewrite it and reinvent that model. And just to give everyone a sense of the gravitas of the situation, by reinventing the identity model for monetization, we are effectively reinventing the internet and creating a new method for digital economy that will go beyond browsers to a unified view of browsers, devices, CTV, and other types of things. And in order for that to work, collaboration, transparency are super critical, but also taking all of our preconceived ideas of how internet advertising works and throwing them away is pretty important. And I think that, in a few years, 5 years, 10 years, we will look back at antiquated concepts like DSPs and SSPs and all these other things, and we'll say, what was that? What were we even talking about? So I think, one of the keys to making this transition and to continue to evolve our industry is to get rid of some of our old ways of thinking and embrace innovation and new approaches. And I think if we're able to do that, we will not only have a sustainable advertising ecosystem, we'll have a better internet and a better digital economy as a result.
Okay, let's see maybe what Daniel has to say about
I think Tom outlined some of the key issues, and I would say we are getting as close to a blank slate as we could actually imagine. Thomas outlined some of the key issues. We need to re-architect the system and so forth. But I think it's important to also step back from COVID. Usually advertising overall is driven by both cyclical and structural factors. And usually recessions are cyclical factors. The market is affected briefly and then everything returns to normal. We do see a lot of structural changes here in terms of consumption. We see massive transformation in terms of e-commerce, so really moving away from gradual to sudden change. And there's indeed the hope that this will accelerate the move towards programmatic, towards automated, towards data-driven models as advertising spend comes under scrutiny and needs to be more accountable. However, if we look at previous recessions, I think we need to be careful to overestimate the pace of this change. Consumer change in particular is extremely fickle and doesn't really change long-term that fast. So for instance, we saw in the previous recession, savings rate go up tremendously, but then dropping to regular levels a couple of months later and so forth. So we'll have this intermediate new normal. But I think it's important, if we look at all the structural issues that Thomas outlined, the programmatic or the change that we're seeing is embedded in much broader changes on how advertisers think about media and think of media buying. When we look at historical data, we've seen increasing decoupling of ad spend and economic growth. Sadly, not in times of recessions, but in particular in times of normal growth. And the key factor is that the Fortune 500 companies, that the share of revenue they spend on advertising and promotions is actually going down. Advertising these days needs to work much harder for its money. That also means that with these new models we are creating in programmatic, we need to move away from media KPIs to more business KPIs to bridge the CMO, CFO gap and attract more spend sustainably. That means that the skills, requirements in programmatic to work on this new infrastructure that Tom is outlining need to change. We need to, programmatic won't exist in a silo in 5 years, but it's going to be much more deeply integrated in databases, CRM systems, and so forth. And this also means actually that it's not just about data. As important as identity is, increasingly we are moving towards a world where the power of interpretation is becoming ever more important. And we see that in a web that's anonymous by default. Who owns the models? Who owns the inputs, but also the mechanisms of interpretation to make sense of this? So this can create new biases, new forms of market power, and can enable the driving of knowledge and how the market operates. And it's crucial for us is we're building an open system, not just that we have an open infrastructure, that we have an open sharing of data, but that we can pool the resources, technical and financial resources, to ensure that machine learning models remain open, accountable, and that the power of interpretation is evenly distributed.
Wow, I would say that there's a lot of things we can probably get into in more details in what you both said. One of the things you both mentioned is the increase, obviously, of the consumption that will continue. That it's not specifically COVID related. It's been probably an accelerator, but it will continue. And I would like to have maybe your point of view or a deeper analysis on how you linked it to what you said about identity, because we're also seeing that users are moving that digital consumption away from devices where personal information could have been tracked or are tracked currently, but will not be in the future.
Well, I mean, I think one of the key characteristics of the new digital economy is diversity. You know, in the old model, people went to to PCs and they cranked them up and went, oh, and then they fired up a web browser and then they went around the internet and on this browser experience, and that was the digital economy. And that's not the way it is anymore. Web browsers are part of the system. Mobile devices, smart speakers, and increasingly OTT and different ways of consuming long form content. So a user's digital experience is far more diverse, and reaching that user means reaching them on several different types of media and several different types of devices. And that's one of the things that the industry really struggles with, is a concept of you that goes beyond the device you're on. Literally, the programmatic world views each device or each access method as a different person. And we don't have good ways to correlate a user experience across the web. And that's something we need to figure out. And what's equally interesting is we talk about identity a lot in this industry. It's to the point where it's like, I can't get through an hour without some identity conversation. And we're almost always talking about web browsers, cookies and web browsers. It's like, what a boring topic that is. You know, we're in a existential place right now with CTV and over the top video, where there is no identity regime at all. It's an anarchic mess of different systems and subsystems. And the current regime on mobile devices, which is one of the key access mechanisms for digital, is going to change. And in fact, a lot of people still don't necessarily register that IDFAs and Android IDs are probably not going to be here in a year or two. So all of these things really frame the identity conversation. I think we spend way too much time obsessing around browser cookies and not about a holistic view of the user digital experience and how it changes throughout the day, and then from day to day, week to week, month to month. So that'd be kind of something I think we really need to pay attention to.
It's kind of funny that it's 2020 and we're talking about this, because when I started as an analyst in programmatic 2009, that was always the promise. And it seems that this promise hasn't changed, and we're only now starting to address it. But I also think that as important as identity is, we're kind of over-obsessing with it. As programmatic moves into other media, as we've earlier said, all these other media, out of home, television, they have other ways of understanding audiences and trading audiences. There's more of a, let's say, reference to location, and that's not the location of a single user, but general, more broad geolocation clusters. And there's also the household reference to television. And I think we, coming from the pure digital world, from the world of display, from mobile that moved into video, we can actually learn a lot from these ancient or traditional media by saying, does user targeting or does addressability necessarily always need to be on an individual basis? And if we want to have a programmatic ecosystem that goes across all different media, shouldn't we take some more of these aggregated concepts and then translate them into the digital world? Maybe that's something that if we're moving towards a web that's anonymous by default, where the logged in or the consented user will be the exception, is something that we have to do anyways.
I mean, I agree we have to do that, but I don't think we're overemphasizing it all. In fact, I think we're underemphasizing it, because this is the magnitude of the identity change is impossible to overstate. We have a model today where we take cookies, identifiers, we throw into buyers, and buyers do magic. They go, whoo, and out pop segments and purposes and whatever they're doing. That is going to end, and the fundamental foundation of which everything works is completely going to be rewritten, and power is going to move away from the buyer to some combination of the publisher and the browser. And one of the interesting little subplots here is we have a war or a battle or a disagreement or whatever you want to call it, a chess game between the publisher and the browser right now, around control, around who gets to make the decisions, who decides what anonymous means, and who assembles what you're calling cohorts. I mean, so the new model is, instead of passing IDs to buyers and buyers do magic, we're going to create the magic on the browser and on the publisher site. And that magic means the assemblance of groups or segments or interest groups that can then be bought against. So the shift of power away from the buyer, power is not the right word, but the shift of responsibility to the publisher and the browser is a massive change. And most buyers are not yet equipped to be able to deal with that. And so this shift is going to be interesting because it is fundamentally a different way of doing things, a better way, I believe, but certainly something that's going to impact and change everyone from the up and down the advertising ecosystem.
Well, I see a huge promise in that vision that you outlined. At the same time, I'm very concerned that this power, or to say, I see less of a power on the sell side, on the publisher side, as an obligation. And what you say, if we look at surveys we've done at IB Europe, confirm that there's a lot of expectation from the buy side that the sell side will fix all these issues, that the sell side will deliver the identity and will deliver the data. But we have some markets that have very strong sales sides, strong alliances, and other markets where it isn't the case. And we've always seen, if we look at how programmatic spend is going, that it's not just going to premium publishers or premium destinations, but broadly across the web. So do you really think that, let's say, login alliances or ID systems will be enough to kind of retain the scale of programmatic, which was always part of it? I'm doubtful.
I don't think login alliances are going to go farther than maybe 20–25% of the covered internet. And I think that, you're going to have it's going to be a breadth versus depth debate for identity. The internet will be anonymous by default, which means there will be no identifier, and we will use groups and cohorts and first party data to establish segments on the sell side. There will be some users that opt into an identity system. Say, I really like shoes, I really like cars, I really like whatever I like, and I will opt into a system and volunteer email address information and PII in order to get access to that group. But that'll be the minority, not the majority. And so that's what has to shift. I mean, we talk a lot about groups and cohorts. Buyers don't buy that way today. Even now, we're 6 months into the cookie apocalypse and the end of cookies. We've made no progress at all as an industry about really transforming at scale. So, I think it requires buyers to consume information in a different way, and it requires us to kind of retool the fundamental data plumbing in our industry to get there. But I do think it will happen, and I do not expect, we're not moving to a logged in internet. There will be logged in users, and that will be an important subcomponent, but I don't think I want a logged in internet. An internet where in order to get content, you have to give up PII. It's not the internet we built. It's not the internet we're moving towards. We're moving towards an internet that is default anonymous, and the user has the power and the choice to select things that they really want and care about.
And I guess that circle back to what you both mentioned about the infrastructure, that what we're using today, what we're going to have to build for the future to support this new way of trading advertising, basically.
Yes, I think when we look at, I think there's always this challenge between an infrastructure that has been growing organically, and that was all about a democratic access to supply and demand, and the ability to really have something that is robust, that is scalable, and that can work with new models. So I think, as Tom said, it's time to redesign. It's the best time to do it is now, but there's a lot of work to do. And back to the point about data. No, I agree, data is important, the validity model, but one of my real concerns is the interpretation. So who owns, as I said in my opening statement, who has the power of interpretation? Let's say we're having the open programmatic world on the one hand, and we're having a platform world on the other. As the world of cloud and first-party advertiser data are moving closer together, and that's partly owned by large platforms, there's a risk that those who can make the best decisions, those who can make the best predictions, those who have the best models, are not the ones who advocate an open internet. And I think on top of investments and innovations in data, we need actually to think about how, as the disparate players in this ecosystem we are, how can we create an infrastructure for interpretation? And how can that be different from, for instance, what large platforms are doing with different standards? So if we're talking about open source software, shouldn't we have the same with, let's say, explainable AI, with auditable models and so forth? And I think that could be a really powerful way for this ethos that Thomas outlined to kind of go forward and separate itself from what many of the walled gardens are doing.
Yeah, I think that's like the rallying cry of programmatic. This is like the recurring theme that happens every month in our industry is whatever it is, the walled gardens are coming and we're all doomed. There's no future for the internet web, independent web. You can't be an independent publisher. You're just going to be swallowed up by, two or three nefarious walled gardens. And you know what? That hasn't happened. We've survived as an an independent, open internet, and we're continuing to survive and thrive. And the key to that is going to be federation. The key to that is cooperation. If you want to have an open internet with independent publishers that are strong and growing and innovating, they have to be able to share information. They have to be able to cooperate to get to the scale of a large walled garden like a search engine or whatnot. And that, I think, is something that we have finally figured out as an industry, that you have to team together to get the scale, the coverage, and the consistency of operations that are necessary to be able to compete with the walled gardens. And that transformation, I think, is underway, but it's quite difficult. I mean, I gave a speech a couple months ago called "The War is Over," and the concept was buyers and sellers are friends now. And literally within 10 minutes, that thesis was lying tattered on the side of the road, because there still are different interests between buyers and sellers. And there are different interests between different types of publishers and different geos. But if we don't figure out how publishers can team together to combine their data assets into one seamless audience pool, if we can't cooperate to create these groups and these cohorts for buyers to buy, we're not going to get very far. So the gravity of the need for cooperation and standards, I think, is greater now than ever. And that's important, because it means the role of the IEB and the role of Prebid and the role of the European Net ID, which are three of kind of the most important organizations in our industry, has gone from let's host a party and figure out which kind of champagne glasses to use, to if you don't figure this out, you're going to be in deep trouble. So the gravity and importance of groups like this, I think, has grown up, has really increased immensely.
But there seems to be, you mentioned earlier, I feel there's still this big gap between kind of the promise and the practice. We realize what we got to do. We realize it's urgent. We can realize the clock is ticking, but not much has really happened. To give you an example, I work a lot with publishers to reconcile their SSP reporting systems and try to run some analytics on, for instance, demand preference optimization and so forth. And as much as publishers need to come together and form alliances, if a publisher works with 6 or 7 different SSPs, you have data taxonomies, you have reporting systems that aren't compatible, you have different naming conventions, the time the data is available varies, the API documentation is often patchy at best. So even the best publishers really struggle to get a complete view, not just of the programmatic supply chain, but actually how certain partners they're working with are performing. And so far, when I spoke to SSPs, I found the response for stronger collaboration, for defining standards on that level, I found it quite muted. And I find that quite surprising, in particular, given the regulatory pressures that the industry also finds itself under. And I think that's an area that we also need to, from a service provider perspective, push much further and be bolder about collaboration and not see enemies everywhere.
Yeah, it's interesting kind of debate as to whether we've come super far in our efforts to open up the industry, or whether we have a long way to go. And I think you could make both arguments. I think we do have a long way to go, but I also think we've come really far. If you look at this industry a few years ago, it was completely dominated by ad servers. The center of the publisher world was the ad server. It was this glowing gold thing, like in the corner, with those velvet ropes around it, and that was the center of the advertising universe. And it was a complete black box that nobody knew how it worked. You couldn't even get reports out of it. And the fact that now we are trying to share log files and create a common view of how the industry works, the fact we're even trying, I think, is progress. However, I think you're absolutely right, Daniel, that it's ludicrous how we have different names for auctions. We don't have a common identifier for an impression across the industry that we can use to be able to avoid duplicative inventory and fraud and these types of things. So, I think you can go either way, that we've come a long way, but we still have a long way to go. But you're not going to be a mature industry that's the centerpiece of how monetization occurs if you can't solve basic problems of transparency, reporting, and how your systems work. And one of the, and go back to identity real quick, what I always hear from, every week there's another identity provider that has this magic way of making their ID work in Safari, but we can't tell you how it works because it's a secret and it's patented. That kind of stuff's got to go away in our industry, because if you can't explain how your stuff works, you shouldn't be here. We have to have systems that are open and auditable, and software that's owned by the community. And I think that's a critical critical step we need to take. And I agree, Daniel, we're not all the way there yet.
Yeah, and I think since the first DMEXCO that everyone has attended, we know that there's no kind of silver bullet in the industry, but a lot of smoke and mirrors. I agree that we have come a long way, and I think one of the future areas, when we talk about standards, we got STXT, SEDAS, JSON, supply chain object, all these different things that also, in theory at least, enable a better understanding of the supply chain, and that trust, not in this supply chain right now, we know there's some murky aspects to it, but trust in the willingness and the ability of the industry to fix it and to move to a better model is essential. For me, that doesn't just mean that reporting is fixed, that you can see the data. If you look at some of these ISPA studies and so forth, they were mainly about seeing the data, but I think some wrong conclusions were drawn because they couldn't really understand what was going on. We are in a world where certain, vendor relationships, it could be a business logic or it could be an algorithmic logic that defines how spend is flowing. So what I learned, to really understand how everything is going, you need to inject something in the system, and you need to see the feedback that it gives to really understand what's going on under the hood. A static description of the data doesn't necessarily solve all those things. And I think as buyers and sellers get smarter, we already have custom algorithms on the buy side, that this area of transparency and the ability to act on it will actually become more important. And I look forward to the industry addressing these issues as well, on top of identity and the basics.
Let me ask you this. I mean, how come, you mentioned sellers JSON and supply chain object and as.text. These are all things that happen super fast and help shine the light on how inventory is presented to market. Where's buyers JSON? Buyers JSON is the same level of visibility into seats on the buy side. And you know what? This has been introduced months ago and nothing's happening. It seems like change and transparency is applied more rigorously to publishers and not to buyers. And to me, that's a signal that we're not collaborating in the right ways, and we need to get better at what we're doing, because I think it's equally important that the world has visibility into the buy path as the sell path, because it's one path, and these distinctions between platforms are going to go away. And so I would love it baffles me how some of these tools we've developed for sellers haven't spread to the entire ecosystem.
I think that's an interesting point. I think it's always where technology and culture collide. We've talked a lot about the fear of finding out. Marketer incentives are often quite different when they have some spend and they realize it's not working as intended. Who's accountable? Some rely on experts, on agencies or other intermediaries. Maybe it's if you look at the marketer themselves, that their incentives to figure out what's going on are quite different from that of the publisher. Publisher, really, monetization, something crucial, depends on it. Their connections to media pluralism and so forth, which is also why regulation is looking so closely at it. But on the marketer side, I think the objectives are much more diverse, and not everyone wants to see or hear what's going on because they're just fine where they are right now.
Yeah, I'm not sure there's real vehicles for buyers and sellers to collaborate as much as there should be. The IAB is definitely doing some things there. Prebid's trying to do things there, but any effort here has to have buyers and sellers represented. And I'll give you another example: the privacy sandbox thing that we've been talking about, the identity situation. The W3C has a privacy sandbox controlled essentially by the browser community, and a lot of sellers are there. We are there every day. And there's one going on right now, actually. But the buyer community does not have as much visibility, and we absolutely have to have buyers, agencies, brands, and platforms at the table in order to successfully get to where we need to be.
Great.
And I think that's something you're starting to see within the Prebid organization, basically having some vendors from the buy side joining and taking part in that conversation. So can we consider that a start, at least?
Absolutely, and we have a buyer tier for agencies and brands in pre-bid now, and we are actively trying to get more agency participation, because you just can't make these decisions without understanding how buyers buy, how their technology is evolving, how their databases work, and how segments are consumed. These things have to be developed together, or else it's going to impede our progress, and kind of continue this fear that walled gardens or a handful of small tech platforms are going to dominate our industry.
And I think the economic incentives of agencies are actually growing as they're moving away from, my native market is Germany, where kind of a more black boxed or arbitrage-based model has been, I think, more prominent than in other markets. But that's slowly changing. So agencies are coming under pressure. They're reviewing the entire economic model, and of course they're caught between, the tension. They can't change right now, but they also can't wait for the future. But I think they're more and more finding models how it could work. And that means I'm confident they will be more open to the initiative, Tom, that you described, not just because they have to, but they also realize that they need new economic models, and they need to tie their future to those models and not to the ones they have relied on in the past.
Agree with that.
Maybe since I'm looking at the clock and I'm thinking that time is flying, maybe we can go back on the pure role of programmatic in all that. So you both mentioned that you're seeing a great shift coming in what programmatic really is and how it supports the way we can transact. So maybe can you develop a bit on that part?
Want to go, Tom?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think a couple of things. We're starting to see is programmatic is the anchor for all types of digital communications, and it's a shift of technology away from ad servers and kind of static configurations towards machine learning and automation. And more of what we're doing is going to be automated, and it's going to transact in open market and in private marketplaces. And the shift is particularly strong in television and long form content. We've been doing programmatic for display advertising for 10 years now, and I think we kind of have a sense of how that works. But both the mobile app market and the CTV market have lagged way behind. It continued to be direct sold, anchored in ad servers, and very non-transparent in terms of how things work. People still bought spots or still buy spots. That's changing. I mean, the acceleration of CTV in long-form video content on digital is really hard to overestimate. And you're even starting to see the mobile app ecosystem develop some level of transparency and rationality to it. So I think it comes. The critical change is the entire ecosystem is moving to a common model, and we are going to get to a point where we have a common view of households and users and those types of things. So I think that's really the big shift, is that the browser is something when we stop talking about browsers and we stop talking about cookies, that's when we will have succeeded.
Mm-hmm. Now, from a market perspective, we're now seeing in Europe since 2017 was kind of the watershed moment, where more than 50% of all digital ad spend, so banner video, excluding social, was transacted programmatically, either through auction or fixed price models. Now, 2020, we predict it's going to approach around 65%. So it's a massive increase, and we're moving really towards this programmatic first world. When we look at CTV, speaking from a European perspective, we do see all those markets, also the audio programmatic market, still in its infancy, but growing very quickly. There have typically been, in particular in seller-driven markets, strong reservations about giving up control, cultural clashes in the organization, who's responsible for what type of inventory. But I think the evolution of programmatic to the world of video has given a great blueprint how that could be made easier. And well, we now see the CTV market just a couple of 100 million euros in Europe, but growing quickly. We probably see around a 45% year-on-year growth for the next 3 years.
Thank you for that insight. And since you're talking about new device, like the shift from standard old way broader banner display to new forms of advertising on new devices. I can see there's someone who mentioned in the comment AR advertising. That's how does that how do we expect it to grow as it brings like digital into the physical post COVID-19? Have you any thought on that?
You mean
I think it's going to be quite slow. Go ahead, Daniel.
AR, the augmented reality. I think it's, this is going to be really tiny. I mean, the addressable market for AR itself is very tiny, and I think there are more. AR glasses hidden under conference seats than in households today. So I think we first have to see, is this really something that is a next consumer platform? I think we have often looked for the next platform after mobile. We haven't found it. I don't think AR is it, and I don't see advertising happening there anytime soon, apart from maybe some experimental spend or some, let's say, a car showroom marketing apps, but not something that's going to be big, and not something where I see programmatic anytime soon. I think much more important is how people change interactions with devices. For instance, or new usage situations. For instance, game advertising, which has been really, where you have some AR stuff, but that has been very dominated by computer brands and so forth. And if you look at the advertiser portfolio of Twitch and others, it has become much more mainstream, much broader, as it's been realized. It's not just 16-year-old boys sitting in the mom's basement who are gamers, but it's much broader, much more diverse demographics. So if we look at hotspots of growth, I wouldn't just look at new devices or the next platform, but I would look at types of consumption. And I think the interactive element of gaming is really interesting. Plus, of course, gaming streaming to the point of a video or CTV.
Yeah, I would agree that AR advertising is probably not a thing and not going to blow up in 2020. But I think the reason for that is we as an industry are horrible at new format innovation. Even look at native, which is seems now to be so simple and obvious. We struggle as an industry to scale native advertising much less, and things like audio, streamed audio is finally becoming a first-class citizen because we're not super good at enabling innovation. We're really good at slapping banners on everything, and now what we're doing is just putting video on everything. You name it, just run a video on top of it, and everything's going to be fine, allegedly. I think we need to do a better job in customizing the message format to the device and the user experience instead of just slapping old formats on new technologies. So it would be great if I could, I would love to be able to sit here and say that in-game and in VR experiences could be augmented through marketing, but we don't, we're still trying to figure out how to handle 3 different ad sizes on the same web page, as if it's some magical difficult thing. So I think innovation and developing a framework based on open source to be able to develop these new formats and introduce them fast would certainly behoove the industry and help us move forward.
I think it's actually just symptomatic for the broader industry. I've never seen an industry that talks so much about innovation, but that is inherently so conservative. Doing things as usual is, I think, more common in advertising, particularly when it comes to advertising and spend allocation than many other industries I've observed.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And jumping onto that, there's a question that just popped up that is asking, why is it so slow to update new formats? So why is that? What is the issue we're not managing to overcome in our industry?
I think the main issue is creatives and the way the buyers buy. When you create campaign, I think a lot of the campaigns that are created are still centered around television. They're anchored in this concept of the 15-second video spot that plays in a pod on TV. And it's just harder for the creatives to adapt to these different types of formats. And one of the challenges we do face is we have publishers of many, many shapes and sizes. We have apps, you have websites, you have CTV, you have smart speakers, and then you have all these various platforms up the chain that everything has to kind of flow through. So it does tend to move to kind of a lowest common denominator thing where, it's a banner or it's a video. So I think developing better frameworks for buyers and sellers to match their inventory to the creative is something that hopefully we can get some real thought behind and some innovation to enable more rapid introduction of these new ideas.
I also think dynamic creative or other creative optimization is a very hot area, and I think we're not really utilizing the potentials of digital feedback channels of programmatic, but purely seeing it as an infrastructure or a new vessel in which we can just pour the old stuff. Now, let's say TV ads being repurposed for video ads, or just an ad that's being done once being repurposed for other channels. And I think it's a mistake to just see technology as a pure delivery mechanism, but it needs to be much broader, much more deeply connected to the creative potentials that are coming through customization, through feedback, through learning, through creating different versions that can be distributed quickly and so forth. And here's a new area, and we've talked about machine learning a lot in advertising, and to my earlier point on promise and practice and innovation, I don't think it's really widespread. But once that comes and we can run live experiments at scale, let's assume you have 1,000 different creatives, and you need to match creative, device, time, and some other metrics. The human mind would explode. Cognitively, it's not possible for us to do that. But if we run a lot of experiments, imagine like thousands of A/B tests at the same time, and machines find the optimal combinations of which things go together, we use a programmatic infrastructure, but we add completely new value on top of that infrastructure. And I think that's a huge area that the industry doesn't really talk too much about, probably because it's complex, because advertisers aren't there. But when it comes to where's future value generation in this industry, beyond identity, beyond attribution and so forth, I see it primarily there. Not thinking about programmatic as an infrastructure, but a different way of doing things from both a creative and a business perspective.
Thank you. I'm going to jump into some of the questions that have been asked live before we close this interesting session. So I'll pick one or two for you guys to answer. There's one that is, how do you think the reduced visibility into user identity on devices will impact the DOOH market?
Could you repeat that? I didn't hear the first part.
How do you think the reduced visibility on user identity on devices will impact the DOOH market? So yeah, because DOOH is not using user identity per se. So will it take advantage of the fact that this concept is also kind of vanishing from what we're doing today?
I think so. I mean, I think that I again would come back to saying I view the user experience as holistic and not balkanized or isolated. I mean, so the user experience, you're gonna have out of home experiences, whether it's billboards or elevators or taxi cabs or all the things that you're consuming, and those need to be tied back to your mobile device and your OTT device and your browser experience. So I think OOH is part of the puzzle, and it is removing some of the individual identity issues. But I'd also think that OOH is going to be tied very much to mobile handsets, and that those two experiences are going to converge over time. So I'm not necessarily buying that that OOH is the pioneer of anonymous internet. It's probably not, a little bit of an overstatement, but certainly I do think OOH is very much a key component of the overall user experience, and tying these things together is pretty critical.
I'm not sure I understood the question entirely. So but let me try. So how does identity, mobile IDs, how does that affect OOH? I think so far, some OOH, or smarter OOH, has used mobile IDs or mobile just location data as a way to validate exposure and to better understand what type of people are passing by a screen. So we've seen some partnerships between OOH providers and mobile phone operators and so forth. But I wouldn't see that as something that is critical for OOH, in particular when it comes to what's called personalization. More important, OOH is maybe one of the last, or will be one of the remaining last mass media. And in a world of hyper personalization, mass reach is going to be important. It's not just that stuff that is or that adverts that are not targeted are necessarily wasted. There's some virtue in wastage, particularly when you look at the psychology of marketing, creating envy, broad awareness, and so forth. And out of home is perfect for that. And I see when it comes to programmatic or customization, rather things like weather or adapting in an ambient way, adapting to how the location around you changes, We can use non-personal data for signals, like traffic, for instance, like passerby density, trains arriving, and so forth. So I don't think out of home necessarily needs identity. However, when it comes to tying it back to something in an attribution model, something more holistic, as Tom says, it would be desirable. But there can be a lot of innovation in out of home, digital out of home, programmatically without PII.
Okay. Another topic that came up several times into the questions for you is around collaboration. So what do you think about the recent publisher initiatives like Ozone in the UK, where publisher have already tried to collaborate and to form alliances before, but with different level of success? So is it too small or is it too late? And how do you see, or what do you think is needed to change to get collaboration really rolling into the industry?
Well, I mean, I think that these publisher alliances are very good steps in the right direction towards getting to scale. But I think you know, that what I would like to see happen is more collaboration on the actual standards and software. You know, marketing alliances are great to pool assets to be able to have more selling power and more market power in the industry. But standardizing how we do things amongst all publishers, whether they're an app provider or a website or anything in between, is kind of more important. It's the technical collaboration, having standards, like, you know, to the earlier point about all these different log files that don't work together, or, you know, call the same thing by, you know, the same field 5 different categories. But we need to change that stuff. So I think you know, publisher alliances are a good first step, but alliances that cross between buyers and sellers and establish common mechanisms, or this is how it's going to be done in an open, transparent way, is what we really need. I mean, the idea of a bunch of publishers getting together and putting sandbags up and, you know, and going to battle with buyers is not a thing. I mean, enough. We have to develop standardized mechanisms for buyers and sellers to interact, not just you know, alliances of sellers and buyers. So I think that's the next step, and I think we're already down a road there.
Yeah, I think the future of collaboration needs the best of both worlds. It needs joint technical standards, not just adopting them, but contributing to their development. And it also needs a business layer. And publishers are highly political, and we've seen the topic of alliances a lot. Valérie, I think in your native market, France, I remember Audience Square, Laplace, and so forth. Many of these, you know, pioneering alliances that have been adopted across the world, and many have failed, not because the idea was bad, but because there weren't really proper governance structures, so it wasn't clear who was adding value and who was extracting value. And I think specifically about Ozone, the question, I think one of the interesting things is that it has a different governance structure, that you know, the CEOs in publishers are accountable for it. And I think that helps a lot. And if we want publishers to adopt these technical standards, to think more about it, we need them to be able to come together on a business level. Having said that, the business level isn't enough, because, as Tom said, you know, putting up sandbags or basically being a sales house or an ad network 2.0 isn't going to cut it. In particular, any collaboration needs to be not just on the level of media, so ad spend, but also on the level of data, but also then on the level of analytics. And that requires engagement with the technical standards.
And I would rebound on that one, because there's a question about also what can agencies do better in that collaborative space. And you just mentioned that all the pieces has to come together. Don't you think that agencies also have a role to play, and what that role could be?
I think that's gotten a lot better though. I mean, I think, you know, the technical sophistication of the agencies, the understanding of the building blocks of the digital ecosystem has improved a lot, and we're developing tools and ways for them to participate. So I think the agency side has continued to evolve and open up and become more integrated, and I think that's a positive thing.
I also think, when you look at programmatic campaigns done by agencies, it's not just optimization at the beginning and at the end, but it's more continuous as tools evolve. I think one important thing strategically is how agencies behave in that open source world that Tom outlined. We're seeing more and more from the buy and the sell side, more and more attempts to directly tap into demand or to directly tap into supply. And we see some, one of my worries is that we're seeing not this beautiful open internet, but we're seeing a new splinternet based on business interests where, an agency through partnerships and so forth prefers or monopolizes a given supply or demand path. And that's kind of perverts, in my view, the idea of the democratization that programmatic offers. Now, my prediction is we'll see very different agencies in the futures. Some that will have business models based on, in a sense, closed pipes. These will be, kind of semi-walled, is a part of a semi-walled garden infrastructure. And others that will have an open, more of a kind of hub and spoke model that will try to differentiate through using different paths, using different vendors, accountability, and so forth. I don't know which one is going to be which, but I think not every agency is going to embrace the same model.
And let me advocate for the splinter net, though, because I'm a fan of the splinter net, because I think that the idea that, hey, agency, you go over here in this corner and you have to go through this door is what you go through to do what you need to do. You have to talk to DSPs, and the role of everything is completely, defined, isn't helping. And I think we do need to redefine these different models. Agencies need to do different things. They need to be technically sophisticated and involved in how their dollars translate to working media. And I don't like these rigid definitions of, you, the SSP, you go over here and you do this, and don't stray from your predefined roles. I think we need to break out of some of those confines and rethink what all these categories mean. And agencies do need to understand technology. They do need to be involved in inventory and how inventory is accessed. And the same is true of SSPs, the same is true of publishers. So, I think these attempts for publishers to come together in alliances, good first step, but redefining, the roles in our industry, I think is something that absolutely has to happen. And whenever I hear rigid definitions of you should do this and you can't do that, it makes no sense. That's not how industry's in it.
That absolutely, I totally agree with that. Will we still have the idea of a DSP in 5 years' time? Will we have an SSP in 5 years' time? It might all merge together. I think one of the things that we have to fix is that we remain accountable, and that when there are parallel worlds emerging, then we also have a standard to compare how they operate. Because otherwise, we'll just have parallel pipes, and again, no way of reconciliation. But
that's why I think the splinter net
is a no-brainer.
That's why I think that helps, though, is it allows data. If you have standardization of data and reporting, and it flows amongst everyone in the ecosystem, that solves that problem. I think this rigidity of roles is what has prevented information from being shared up, across different players. This lack of trust and this lack of speaking the same language from a protocols perspective, that's what needs to change. And I think the blowing up of these old definitions is actually going to enable a better, more democratic approach to data and standards. So I view that as a positive thing.
Thank you. Thank you to both of you. We're getting close to the end of our session, but can I ask you both one closing statement before we wrap it up for today?
Sure.
Daniel, you can go first.
You have a question or just a closing statement?
Just a closing statement.
No, good. I think we've seen in this discussion that there are, it's a time of rapid change, and I think we as a programmatic industry really have the power now to define, by what we do in the next 36 months, will probably define how the industry will look like in the next 5 or 10 years. So it's up to us, it's our responsibility to take, I think, what is a historic chance to rethink, rewire, and re-engage with all market participants. And I'm confident that despite all of the many issues that we have, the solutions we've provided so far means that we're going to achieve that.
Yeah, I think that I would echo that. That I think there's a fine line between optimism and change and gravity. So I think that we all have to understand the significance of this moment, especially as it relates to the reinvention of identifiers. And everyone, buyers and sellers, has to take this seriously and become involved. That said, you know, this industry is going to be fine, and we are going to continue to get better at what we're doing. And I really can't stand this good old days, like it's so bad now, it's all going away, the walled gardens are coming for us. That's not the case. The independent internet is stronger than it ever was. We're doing really, really good things around innovating and collaborating and having transparent processes. So there's a lot of reasons to think that we're on the right path here, and that as an industry, we're doing good things. I mean, you can look out your window at any moment and there's some ad tech disaster going on. But in general, the progress is real, and you know, I'm nothing but confident in the future.
So I like this optimistic note on the end. It's always nice to finish on that note. So it's time to close the session for today. I'd like to thank you both, Tom and Daniel, for your insight and this conversation. I also like to thank all the people who dialed in today. So there were more than 220 people, I think. So thank you, everyone. I hope you found this interesting. And for the questions we didn't get to answer live, they will be answered in a written fashion and posted on the AAB Europe blog in the coming days or weeks. So thank you again, and talk soon, I hope. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.